Hello, welcome to the David Wells Experiment. I'm your host, David Wells, and I'm doing my podcast. So anyway, as I often begin, it's been a while since I've done this. There was a period in 2023 where I was doing the podcast every day, where I was doing several. And I've talked about why I did that, so I won't bother you with that. I think I might just do a new one every once in a while. But anyway, that's become almost a staple of all the last couple episodes. So anyway, I might have talked about this before, or at least mentioned it in passing, but something I can't help but wonder is about how people consume information these days. And I'm sure as soon as I say these days, I've antiquated this podcast, because every day is these days. I remember back in 2016, I was saying these days. 2008, these days. And one of the things I've noticed is how people seem to be, well, I was going to say people these days seem to be much more reactionary than they used to. But as it says in my favorite verse from the Bible, there's nothing new under the sun. I know for a fact that I've said in a previous podcast, the biggest difference between today and yesterday is that we have more tools for information. Basically, I don't know that the world is worse than it used to be, but I think we just have more tools to shed light on that. Like, imagine going into a room and you've got like a cheap little flashlight. You turn it on and you see some cockroaches on the floor and you're like, oh my gosh, that's disgusting. Now, those cockroaches existed before you turned on the flashlight. And you might even turn it off. You might turn the flashlight off just so you don't have to think about them. And not seeing them and not acknowledging their existence might actually make you feel better, even though you know they exist. And you think, okay, they can't be that bad. I'll just turn on the overhead light and I'll see, it's not that bad. So you turn off the flashlight and you know the room pretty well. And so you just wander in the dark, and eventually you make yourself to the wall, and your hand traces along to where you think the switch is, and then you feel it. You feel the switch, and you find out, okay, good. I'm going to find out that everything's cool. You flip the switch on, and you're horrified. You see that the whole room is covered with cockroaches, that the little bit that you thought was indicative of the whole was not even close, that things are far worse than you thought. Now, that sounds terrible, and you might have stopped listening to this podcast at this point, which I won't blame you. But I'm going to try to not be so bleak. In fact, this might be a good bit of medicine for people who are bleak. Who knows? So, one of the things that surprises me is I regularly have moments where the news of the world, a really good Queen album, by the way, but no, the actual news of the world, it gets to me. Like, in a way that it used to not. Like, even a couple years ago, I could read news articles like, oh shoot, well, that's difficult, that's something to contend with, but everything's fine over here. And really, it wasn't until COVID happened, when it affected me, where news articles weren't just news articles, when it became something like, oh shoot, is everything going to get upended? Like, and I've followed current events for a long time, at least since the early 2000s. Some of my coworkers weren't even born back then. Some of my coworkers weren't even born until gosh, I think I'm working with a girl who was born in 2007. That's crazy. I remember 2007. What a ride. But anyway, there was bad news back then, but it didn't feel like it touched me. But COVID comes along, and all of a sudden, the status quo has just changed. For some people, it was really significant. For others, not as severely, unless you lived in Florida. But it was kind of astounding how just, it seemed like overnight, things we took for granted, we had to change. And I promise this isn't about COVID, but COVID does play a part in, I think this is one of the reasons why I could get worried by the news. I remember reading about previous diseases like H1N1 and Zika and the MERS respiratory, the Middle Eastern respiratory virus, or the MERS virus. That was all the way back in 2015. And I'm like, oh wow, that's something else. But I could just carry along with life. And it's one of those things where I could acknowledge bad things going on in the world, but again, it wouldn't press on me, and it wouldn't take up so much of my time that I would have problems thinking or functioning throughout the day. Yeah, it wasn't until the events of 2020, where I would hear a bit of news and then think, oh shoot, is life going to be affected by this? But anyway, let's see. It's funny how it's gone, because I feel like things have escalated and de-escalated significantly. Like, in 2020, I was like, it was something that we had to reckon with. What I'm so surprised by is how a world-changing event happens, and then I can only talk about my experience here in Texas. Things acclimate. I really hated that phrase, the new normal. But, I mean, we got used to it. We fit into the rut, the new groove, the new pattern. And it was kind of astounding. I remember the first time I ate at a diner inside was 2020, I think it was July. I hadn't been to a restaurant in months. And I was like, oh wow, we're doing this now. And it was crazy to see. And it was the little things that threw me. First, I noticed there weren't plastic menus anymore. They were all paper. And putting on a mask when I would go to the restroom, and yeah. And I really didn't have much of a problem with wearing a mask. The only funny thing is, the only thing I regret about COVID and how I conducted myself back then was that I never bought a Bane mask, like from Dark Knight Rises, or a voice modulator, so I could be like, you think darkness is your ally, but you merely adopted it. Yeah, it's funny. I never did that, and we had like almost 2 years to be able to do that. But anyway, if I ever do wear a mask, it's if I like my nose is runny and I don't want to gross out customers, or if like, I'm trying to think, what else would I do? Oh yeah, if there's like mold in the air, you know, that throws me. But from personal anecdotal evidence, I've found that when there's mold in the air and I'm coughing and stuff, if I put on a mask, it does help me. But yeah, and I think it was in 21 where we had like supply chain issues. But that happened to everybody. And it's funny, I drive past this one Burger King most days when I'm on my way to work, and it says, we've got burgers again, which is a throwback from in 21 when there were supply chain issues. And I'm like, that was a while ago. It's crazy to think that as I'm recording this in February of 2024. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. Or Singles Day, if you know. I thought that's so ridiculous. Singles Awareness Day. It's one of those things which I feel is ridiculous, but you know, if it makes some people feel better about being single, you know, go with God, God bless, whatever. Anyway, trying to think. Oh yeah, news, how it affected me. Yeah, I guess 2021 was a fairly normal year for me, even more so than 2020. And again, as far as Texas goes, it felt like the first real year where, okay, we're getting back to normal. I remember people thinking in 2020 that things would be back to normal by the end of summer. And it's like, I've said this before, but one of the first moments of sanity I feel in 2020 was movie theaters were a big thing. Some people thought, oh, the theatrical movie experience is going to go away. It didn't. But a lot of theaters were playing because like the new movies were being shelved or put on streaming services. When movie theaters reopened for the first time, they were playing older movies like Jaws and Empire Strikes Back. But one of the first movies that I saw back in theaters was Deadpool, of all movies. And I'm thinking to myself, how appropriate that when the world is going crazy, the movie I watched to restore some semblance of sanity is Deadpool. I'm like, this is great. But anyway, yeah, that was 2020. And going into 2021, we had gotten used to it. And the first thing that felt like, I remember when Greg Abbott, he rescinded like COVID rules, and everybody was like, oh, okay, cool. But really, like, I forget the specifics, but you didn't have to wear a mask anymore, or at least you weren't encouraged to, or something like that. But really, the biggest sign of the times of things were going back to normal. For most of COVID, we weren't allowed to give people ice cream cones. We had to give the customers ice cream in cups. And when they brought those back, that felt like way more of a shift back to normal. And I was like, okay, that's cool. And I also remember one of the things that seemed to show that things were going back to normal was on TV, and I'm saying that, using that as a broad term, because who has like a real TV anymore? Or who watches traditional broadcast television? But anyway, on TV or your smartphone or laptop, I saw less and less of video of President Biden wearing a mask or walking up to a podium with a mask on and taking it off, the whole thing. And I was like, okay, cool. And I feel like the real last experience of like how COVID encroached upon my life personally was every year my college group at church would go to a retreat. And 2021, we didn't have it in 2020 for obvious reasons. 2021, we decided to do it, but everybody had to take a COVID test, which were provided freely. Everybody took the tests. Nobody had it. And we all go to the retreat. I walk in with my mask on, and I noticed I'm one of the only ones. And I'm like, hey, do we need this? And like, oh no, since everybody tested negative, they were like, feel free to not wear it. I'm like, oh, cool. And gosh, I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly or not, but I think, I don't think my church, a lot of churches in Texas, they made masks like optional well early on into about, I want to say in the summer of 2021. My church, it's a Korean church, so they're way more pro-mask, and I think that's just part of the culture. Yeah. I don't think we stopped using masks, or we made them optional, until a little bit after the Omicron variant. So we were a bit late to the game, but when we did do it, I'm like, okay, cool. Anyway, so 21 seemed like, okay, cool. Meanwhile, over on the other side, across the Atlantic, stuff was going down with Ukraine and Russia. And yeah, so Ukraine and Russia, things are starting to get bad. And I read the news all the time, and it was one of those things I was aware of. And then February rolls around, and I've read news about, okay, build up along the border. Again, stuff I've read in the current events, nothing surprises. And then later in February, oh, Russia invades Ukraine. I'm like, oh, wow. I'm like, dang, they actually did it. And we all know the story now. What was supposed to be, or what forces in Russia thought, oh, it'll be a 3-day operation. 2024, still going on. Now, and I'm like, okay, cool. And, well, no, not cool. I'm just, it's one of those things where I'm still kind of in my mindset of reading news. Like, it's probably not a great thing that I've been conditioned to, but, you read news, you read horrible things, and you're like, okay, that's happening. What can you do? And you live with it. And I really didn't have a panic until it was later in 22 when certain figures in Russia, they were saying like all options are on the table for us, and nuclear weapons got thrown in there. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. And it's like, what about MAD? And I heard Dmitry Medvedev, you know, because he used to be president of Russia. I mean, you could argue that because some people say on paper he was, but Putin was really pulling the strings during his tenure. But that's beside the point. Someone who was once the head of state of Russia, even if only on paper, he was saying some stuff. And I remember back in the day, people thought, okay, Medvedev, you know, he'll say and do some things, but he's not as, you know, doesn't take it to the same way that Putin does. And I'm like, bro, calm down. And I'm like, I literally like started to panic, and I was dipping into the restroom at work all the time, not because I had to go or my bladder was full, but because I was pulling up whatever news articles I could. And it started to get to me. And yeah, affected my thinking. It got to a point where I would read stuff about the news and I started to feel dizzy and queasy, and I actually asked to be sent home early from work once. I'm like, shoot. But anyway, you know, you ask God for help, and it's crazy when, you know, he sends an answer. I've talked about this before, but I'll go ahead and mention it again. I remember we go into 23 and my thinking is still messed up. And so for those who don't know, throughout much of the pandemic, I was known around the area for my choice of, you know, funny hats. I still have people who see me like, oh, you're that guy who used to wear the hat all the time. I'm like, oh yeah, that was me. So anyway, for those of you who are sick of hearing about this, sorry, but I'm going to do it again. Probably won't be the last time. Anyway, so let's see. It must have been the beginning of summer in 23. So I have this one coworker. She's new. It's her first day. I noticed she wears this hair clip that's like floral patterned. And at the end of my shift, she's like, hey, you're that guy that used to wear the hat all the time, right? And I'm like, yeah, that's me. And he's like, oh yeah, everyone at my school talked about you. I actually wore this floral pattern thing to reference one of your hats. And it was like such a moment for me where I'm the one who usually references things, but this time I was the reference. And I just thought, oh, that's cool. And like, my grandpa had passed away that year, and I felt shooken up, like it was hard for me to work like I used to. And I even had my manager, after a while, she says to me, I know you're going through some stuff, but it's just an excuse. And the only stuff I talked to her about was my grandpa dying. So really, she was saying, you're just using your grandpa's death as an excuse to not work hard. And that's not true. She lost her husband. I was sympathetic to that. I wasn't angry so much. I was just baffled that someone could be that unempathetic. And she would say things like, well, this isn't hard work. And it's like, yeah, but you know, somebody you've known your whole life dying, that affects you. And I've had other people at my job who they lost someone. They either quit or they were gone for a couple weeks. Me, I just returned to work the next week, and I held up for a while, but then, you know, it started to affect me. I just couldn't deal with stuff the way I used to. I say that to add that I wasn't in a great place when I heard this compliment. And so this girl says like, yeah, I wore this hairpin to reference your hats. And I was elated by this compliment. I'd made an influence and somebody referenced me rather than me making references. And then I posted on Instagram how I was making podcasts again. She was like, oh yeah, I saw that post. And I was like, so you've got a podcast? I'm like, yeah. He's like, that's cool. And so I went into overdrive on making podcasts, as some people will point out. And then and so the entire time she's there, some people might get the wrong impression from this, but I think I just anticipated seeing her, and I think it was because it was like, okay, you've got a fan, someone who has consumed your media and found it enjoyable, and kind of like the way I would consume someone else's media or art, and it left an impression. And there's no logical connection between that feeling of elation and the consumption of news making me, get into a bad headspace. Like, eventually, I sort of got over, like, all the Russia stuff, and even Putin himself, after he let it drag on for a bit, he's like, no, of course we're not going to use weapons. That's crazy. Or nuclear weapons. I have my own idea about that, but, that's not the primary focus. Again, it's current events as usual. And then, of course, but yeah, just that moment where I was paid that lovely compliment, my thinking got shifted. And for the whole time she worked there, which was most of 23, it was really mostly last bit of spring and right before like fall properly began in Texas, which was like September. It was like the day before Mexico's independence, I believe. Anyway, and I noticed as soon as she left, my thinking kind of slipped back into it. I think this time I was a bit more worried about like the situation with Taiwan and China. Yeah, I think as soon as I saw the movie Oppenheimer, I started to be less worried about all the previously mentioned stuff, which is weird. You think that would just compound it, but somehow it helped. Maybe there's a reason I saw Oppenheimer 4 times in theaters. The last time I saw it was with my uncle, because he's like a big science nerd and everything, and he has like one of the first Teslas that was like battery powered. I remember at the end credits, he was like, that was a good movie. I wish my dad could have seen that. I'm like, aw. I think he would have liked it too. Here's to you, Papa Dewey. Anyway. Yeah. So yeah, fall rolls around. I kind of don't have a fan to like kind of prop up my ideas, but I said there wasn't a connection, but as I think about it, I'm thinking, maybe there is. There are two parallel things. So COVID, the lockdowns, the mandates, all those things was a negative thing that forced your mindset into a negative. It hardwired you for negative. It changed your perception for negative. That girl saying like, oh, I'm a fan, it hardwires your brain for positive. Hardwires your perception. And it was a moment it was kind of a road to Damascus moment for me. I'm like, I've got to reassess things. And I was reading, well, Ecclesiastes has always been something. Like, I'm really bad when it comes to reading the Bible. I've read the high points. In 2011, I read all 4 Gospels. And as a teenager, of course, I read Revelation because, who's not edgy and stuff. But one that I always go back to is Ecclesiastes. And as I mentioned, there's that verse that says, there's nothing new under the sun. And, okay, and it was like one of those things where I had to stop and think. And I'm like, I did an assessment of my history of current events. Like, because again, I followed current events for a long time. Not want to give away my age, but it's been a while. If you listen to my podcast and hear the references, you can figure it out. But anyway, it's not so simple as saying, like, bad stuff has happened, but I realized there's a strategy. I thought about all the times I was having, like, meltdowns or days where I'm like, oh shoot, this is it. The day went on. And the next day, and the next day, and the next day, until several months pass. And I'm probably years, and I'm here at the present. Oh, I have one more thing for 20. Like, one more comment about the Russia and Ukraine stuff. I got worried to an extent that I genuinely feared that the U.S. would get involved and my brothers who are of military age would get drafted. I've got one brother who's approaching the end of draft age, and one who's he's got a couple more years where he could still be drafted. And then I've got a stepbrother who's 12 years younger than me. So let's see, I'm 36, I'll be 37 this year. So he'll have about at least 11 more years where he's got to think about that, or think of it as a possibility. And I'm like, shoot. And then I realized I've got some coworkers who they're just leaving high school. And I'm like, dang, they've got to think about this for another 18 years. And some of them, they're talking about going into the military. Like, that's what I want to do with my life. So I worry about them less. But anyway, again, I stopped worrying about that, when I had my mind shift. And it's amazing what happens when you're re-hardwired and your perception changed. I went so dormant from making podcasts. I was making several times a day. And then, of course, I stopped. And again, I think it had to do with hardware and perception. So I'd like to take it back to the early 2000s, at the height of my video game playing. My console was a PlayStation. I might have told this story before, but I don't remember. Anyway. Okay, so I'm not on the final boss, but I'm on one of the final bosses. And I remember it was freaking difficult. The boss would appear, he'd start moving and attacking. I would try to jump out of the way and fire, but I seemed to get hit no matter what. And it doesn't matter how many times I go into this level, like, I just get killed. Like, it doesn't seem like there's a single right thing I can do. And I'm like, I have no clue how I'm going to beat this guy. But then I had this epiphany. I'm like, okay, next time, go into the level, don't do anything. I'm thinking like, what? Yeah, don't do anything. Just watch what this guy is doing. Pay attention. Don't worry about reacting. Just try to look at the pattern. Do it a couple times until you feel like you've got it down. It's like, okay, so I do this a couple times. I die several times, but I start to notice, oh, he's doing this, then he's doing this, and this, and this, and this. And I'm like, I think if I do this, I'll be good. I think if I do this when he does this, I can land a shot. And so I'm like, okay. So finally, I feel confident with I know what's going to happen. So I go into the boss level. This time, I know where this guy's going to land. I know when he's going to shoot, when I need to jump, when I need to fire, and I get his health down halfway. Now this is the Mega Man X game, so of course when they reach the halfway point, they change their tactics, and I'm dying again. But I just do the same thing. I watch, and when I feel like I've got a good feel for what's going on, I react, and I beat him. And I think that might be one of my greatest life lessons. Probably one of those things I'll talk about forever while I'm around. And that was from a video game. And I think that's kind of the point of all this, is like people take in info and then they react. They feel like they have to, like, oh man, something so bad is happening. But they don't pause to stop and think. Like, wait a minute. This, and this. So is it really going to be like this? They really don't take things into consideration. In fact, you could say that people reacting, is how we got into World War I. Now, I don't want to scare anybody because World War III is getting thrown around a lot on social media. And I think the reason people drop stuff like this is because scary things elicit responses. They make people go, oh my gosh, what do we do? What do we do? And they make scary stuff makes people way more influenced. Scary stuff makes people sleep with the lights on. Scary stuff makes people buy things to calm themselves down. Scary stuff makes people buy copious amounts of energy drinks so they can work hard. It makes them buy insurance for things that may or may not happen in the future. It makes them do so many things. When you're afraid, you're so malleable. You can be easily influenced. And it's not hard to scare people. I was talking about how when I would read the news, I started to see a pattern, even prior to my good experience, even before I found out, oh, I've got a fan. I started to notice a pattern with the news. There was a cycle. Even in the midst of my worry and panic, I started to see things. I would see people say, why Russia will use nukes, why Russia won't. And it was one of those things like, okay, this was my moment of observation. This was my moment of like, okay, if this guy jumps here, I can dodge here, and when he jumps here, I'll fire. And it was like, I started to pick up on stuff. And yeah, so it's one of those things where I'm like, And I realized this has happened a lot. I remember kind of right in the middle of the pandemic when we were having supply chain issues. I was reading articles like America's diesel fuel is going to run out in a month. And I was like, I started to worry. I started to panic. Like, supply chain issues will be so much worse. And I remember telling myself at that moment, haven't we had panics before of, oh, this is going to happen? I'm like, you know what? Just wait a month. Wait a month, and if it happens, you know, well, what can you do? And then I remember I saw some video in December saying the US will run out of money in January. And I'm like, and it wasn't even a huge news source. It was a YouTuber with, I think, 10,000 subscribers. I don't even remember who it was. I couldn't remember if you put a gun to my head even. And I remember thinking like, okay, if it happens, it happens. And we're in February. Now, I'm sure there might be some people who are going to say, like, well, yeah, but, and then rattle off stuff. And who knows, in a couple of months, I might be like, oh, shoot, I don't see how we didn't see that coming. But going back to Ecclesiastes, there really is nothing new under the sun. I remember one time I heard a little kid in my restaurant saying, like, why should we study history? And it's like, I gave a response which the grandpa who he was talking with loved. But as I'm talking about it right now, it's like, because things are so cyclical. We think things are a new thing we think everything is so novel, but if we pay attention, it really isn't. Like, you know, school shootings get talked about all the time, and I don't want to denigrate or play down the tragedy that people go through, but they are not new. Columbine was not new. There were school shootings before Columbine. I was astoundingly surprised one evening when I decided to look up the history of school shootings and found out how many there were prior to Columbine. What was new about Columbine, though? 24-hour news channels, cable television, the radio, the very nascent form of the internet. If there was anything novel, it was the information in which news about it was being able to be consumed. And that only happened more and more as technology got better. Steve Jobs was right when he unveiled the smartphone and said this is going to change things. I bet you in the early 2000s, when there was no smartphones, when the internet was getting closer to what we've got now, but still miles off, I cannot help but wonder, had we had smartphones back then, would the SARS outbreak have become the thing that COVID wound up becoming? And you know, in an alternate timeline, could have been. Now, I've done research on SARS, and one of the reasons it didn't become the thing that it became was because the cases dropped dramatically to the point where they became a non-issue. But in some parts of the world, like Singapore, that's the only one that springs to mind, people treated it as such. Now I say in an alternate universe, SARS could have been treated as though it were something that it wasn't. And I say that only because there were early plans for tablets, well, for the iPad in 2002. They changed their idea and was like, let's work on the smartphone, the iPhone instead. But it just makes you, and there were Palm Pilots, so, but it begs the question, what if we had jumped on that technology way sooner, had access to information way more? And I think what the constant onslaught of information does, this is tying it back, it's like me in the video game. You think shots are fired, you gotta jump, when really you just get hit. You get hit with worry, you get hit with panic, hypothetical scenarios. You jump when you should have stayed grounded. You stay grounded when you should have jumped. You don't do anything when a shot should have been fired. It's made us reactionary, or it's increased the probability of reactionaryism, because we have this information, whether it's on the laptop, the smartphone, or the internet device that's stuck in our TV, on a daily basis. So it's like there are perceived or hypothetical shots fired that we got to contend with. And I guess what we got to do is we got to, just go into the level and not do anything. That's the best thing I can come up with. And maybe, take this with a dash of salt, but I think the real last panic I had about this kind of stuff, where I got thrown into a tizzy, was on October 7th, when Israel and Gaza got into their most recent conflict. Because, I'm a Christian, and it made me think like, oh man, if some major thing happens in Israel and it gets to the plains of Megiddo, is this the end times? Are we at the end of the world? And I remember thinking to myself, you've been here before. I mean, this does feel different, because it is different. But I did something that has now become my standard practice for when there's bad news or stuff that seems like it's on the horizon. I go through my back catalog of information in current events or history, and I'm like, so regarding Israel, I'm like, okay, wasn't there something even a couple years ago where Israel and Gaza were fighting? That looked bad. And then wasn't there something in 2006 where it was like a 6-day war or something? I'm like, yes. And it's like, okay, remember that war back in the 60s and 70s where they got attacked by all their surrounding neighbors? I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, it's like, who knows? This could be the big one. This could be the thing where it's like, okay, Jesus is coming back. But at the same time, it could be another story. Now, the news doesn't make it seem that way, but we often tend to think of it that way. When it's happening now, in the present, we do think like, oh man, this is it. This is the big one. But if we just calm down for a minute, we'll be like, it could be, but the pendulum could swing the other way. It could not be. I guess that's one of the things. I'll share one more story where I'm probably going to talk for a couple more minutes, but I'm going to start to wrap things up. Watch, I go talk for another 20. No, I'm going to try to end in less than 10 minutes. A couple weeks ago, right now, there's some friction between Texas and Washington about responding to events happening at the border between Texas and Mexico. Washington and Texas have taken very different approaches. And this kid at my work, who I'm not going to name him, but if you imagine a conservative teenager in Texas he really fits the mold. And so he's just chatting to me while I'm like walking around the lobby, sweeping and wiping tables. And he's like, yeah, did you hear Washington's it's sending troops to the border. There could be a civil war. And I'm like, I can remember that mindset. And it's like, and I think my response is, well, we'll see about that. And I will admit, for a smidgen of time, I'm like, what if he's right? And I start to go back into that old panicky mindset. But then I think, and I'm like, you know what? Everybody loves a revolution. Nobody loves an administration. The idea of a revolution is cool, it's sexy, it's novel. But all revolutions have to fade into administrations. You can look at anything in history, even the really bad ones. They turn into administrations, things that people hate. They turn into DMVs. They turn into public services, into armies, into boring office jobs. It even happened, it's even happened to the Taliban in Afghanistan. One of the funniest articles I saw was Taliban workers bored with office work. One guy said, yeah, after, we took over the country, I got put in an office job and I'm bored. All I do is most of the time is just waste my time on Twitter, and not trying to gloss over anything, but it's like, maybe we've got way more in common with them than we would like to think. Because how many people just idle away their time at work on their smartphones? I suppose if I had a live studio audience, that would be where they laughed. And maybe you're laughing right now too. I sort of lost the point. Oh yes, precedent, and yeah. So it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, why do people go to civil war? They go to civil war when they have lost confidence in a constructed system. Why would any faction of a civil war succeed? Because they would have developed a competing system and there would be an infrastructure. There are all these variables to think about. What would things look like in the aftermath? What would the future look like? What countries would recognize you? What alliances what treaties, what obligations would be forced to have met? There are a lot of factors to think about. And yeah, I'm like, okay, I don't think it's going to happen. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But I'm like, I don't even really seriously think about it. And it's been a couple weeks, and of course the news is already calmed down. And that's as much as I'll get into that. And I'm like, I'm wondering what the day is going to be like when this kid is like, okay, yeah, when he has if he has a similar epiphany. Who knows? Maybe he gets a podcast and he gets a lot of like-minded people to listen to him and he becomes quasi-rich, and maybe I'm like, oh shoot, maybe there is something to stoking people's fears and getting them worked into a panic. Who knows? But hype is not always so malignant. A great example is, the Stanley Cups. They were just boring drink containers. Then one or two famous people is like, hey, this is cool, you should get it. People need something to aim for, and they go after it. And again, I was watching news today, or I was listening to an article about news, and it was talking about problems China is having with its army. I'm like, okay, this runs kind of in the face of all the news I hear about, China's gonna invade in 2025 or 27. And I'm like, this dude lays out several reasons for why, okay, it's not how China would like you to believe things. I'm like, man, that sounds solid. And it's not even like some deep revelatory thing. It's just a bunch of common sense things that, again, my previous history of reading up on current events is held up. I'm like, yeah, I see that. This is, I guess this might sound, again, take this with a dash of salt. And of course, you know, sometimes we have to dwell with uncomfortable truths because of what the repercussions might be. But, you know, find something to distract yourself with. Now, I'm sure there are going to be some people like saying that's infantilizing, that's such bad advice. But I would posit this. There is so much news, so much information that is consciously, actively trying to hardwire your brain and change your perception to get you to think a certain way, that it's like maybe distracting yourself is the healthy option. Maybe distracting yourself is how you keep the balance. Oh, I just got a notice from BioLife. That's where I donate plasma. Anyway. Yeah, like, at some point, to sound like a Frank Capra movie, I was like, you know what? It doesn't make sense in light of everything I'm getting on my phone, but I just have to believe there are better days ahead. Last year when I heard like, oh, Senate and the Congress, they're not going to be able to pass the spending thing. And, oh my goodness, they've just kicked it off to March and next year, and we're going to have to revisit this in 2025. You know, we might have to. And, you know, maybe there are some dark times ahead, but I have to tell myself so that I can function as a person. Because, again, I work in fast food, I wipe tables, I sweep floors, I take out trash. And it's really hard to function when you think, the world's coming to an end, what does anything that I do merit or have value in? I just tell myself there are better days ahead. And I think I kind of have to believe that. I'll give this example of, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. So, and I'll touch on various different things. So 2022, Russia invades. And everyone's like, oh my goodness, how did we not see this coming? And I'm like, okay, you're acting like this was unprecedented, but was it really? Because in 2015, Russia built a bridge between Ukraine and Russia. They can cross over. 2014, they invade Crimea. In 2008, they invaded Georgia, and there was the Chechenian Wars, which there was one in the 90s and one in the 2000s. And yeah, let's see. In the early 90s, there were hardline Soviets who tried to prevent the transition from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation. That didn't go well. There was the Yugoslav Wars in the 90s, the Balkan Wars also, which really only got overshadowed until Columbine happened. There was the bombing of an embassy in Nigeria in the 90s. You know, I could go on. Oh, stuff regarding China. I remember people were panicking. People panic when they hear about like the buildup of its military. But I remember reading not too long ago, maybe a little bit before Xi Jinping, but maybe around that time, China buys freighters from Soviet-era freighters to refurbish, and they're building up their navy. And it's like, okay, I mean, if you pay attention to the news, we all see how those operate. Also, in 1996, when I think Taiwan had its first democratically elected leader, they fired a bunch of missiles towards Taiwan that landed in their waters. But that was 1996. 2006 was 10 years after that. 2016 was 20 years after that. We're in 2024, so I believe that's 28 years later. I could be Nope. Yeah, 28 years later. Now, of course, Xi Jinping is a wild card. He doesn't function as some of his predecessors. But at the same time, it seems as though he's not so far off. Because when he tried his zero COVID policy, people fought back. And even though he doesn't care about as much about money as, again, some of his predecessors, Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, especially not Deng Xiaoping, he still realizes that, people want to get paid. And if they don't get paid, they get angry. So, yeah, I would say distract yourself. Or at least, it's funny, I wouldn't have never said distract yourself. I always complained that people were too distracted, that they didn't follow on the issues. But now I've got to switch my position. There's a healthy balance between consuming news and distracting yourself. Because if you go so naive that, the world's crumbling around you, that's not good. But if, you're so consumed with oh my gosh, the world's falling apart. And you're like, that's great, Rorschach, but so-and-so just had a baby. And well, what does that matter? And dude. Even in the book of Ecclesiastes, and I think I'll wrap things up with this. Even in the book of Ecclesiastes, they make every logical, sound reason for why you should be pessimistic. They make the position that it makes way more sense to be pessimistic and negative and be like, oh man, everything sucks. Why should we even bother with anything? What's the point? The whole book starts off with meaningless, everything is meaningless. That's how it starts. This was written by Solomon, who according to the Bible is the wisest man ever, aside from Jesus. But there are all these moments sprinkled out where he's like, you know what? I've learned that all you can do is look at life as a gift from God. I'm paraphrasing heavily, but I'm summarizing the quote-unquote good parts. Just enjoy your life, your wife, the work you're doing, those little moments. And I remember seeing a post by a friend who's like, who's going to be Batman? Who's going to be the Flash? These are baby questions. You're distracted from the real world. I'm like, well, maybe it is. But sometimes it's interesting. Sometimes the real world distracts you from what really matters. And maybe if war comes to our doorstep, we can't be distracted. We gotta focus. But I don't know. I guess if you're like me, if you're in that spot where you're just so consumed with how wrong things could go, you're missing out on how right things could be. And maybe it's all that negative, maybe it's all that thinking about how wrong things could turn that winds up making them wrong. I feel like maybe just from anecdotal evidence, maybe I'll only have cause to think that everything is going wrong when I hand food to guests and they don't say thank you, when I stop saying my pleasure, you're welcome, or no problem, when I stop talking with them and making jokes, maybe when people are like, they grab their food and go, or they're like, thank you so much for being out here. There's an episode in The Office when Andy says, I wish there was a way that you could know you're in the good old days while you're still in them. And I think I realized the solution to that is gratitude. You know, count your blessings. Think about how good things are. Some bad stuff has to be acknowledged. No argument there. But a balance has to be struck. You should think about how good things are, because they could be worse. So, as I've said before, this has been the David Wells Experiment. Have an absolutely lovely day. Hope all your dreams come true. And we will see you next time. Bye.